Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Joseph Attic, Executive Chairman of ID for Africa, and this is our 24th LiveCast, which is also part 2 of the trilogy on the dark side of identity, mitigating the risks. I want to welcome you all and thank you for being with us as we continue to pursue a topic that has generated a lot of interest from all sectors and from around the world. Part 1 broke new grounds. It led to an open and genuine dialogue on the core concern of exclusion. Part 2 today promises to go even farther and deeper in our exploration through a data-centric view of the dark side of identity. Once again, we have an incredible lineup of thoughtful experts joining me in a series of segments of different formats. So stay with us. This will be another can't miss, informative and absorbing LiveCast. Before we start today's episode, I'd like to thank our development partners, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, for their support of our LiveCasts. Their patronage enables us to bring you quality, unbiased content that keeps the community together around meaningful dialogue. I also like to appeal to all of you to support your movement by remembering to like, share, and subscribe to the ID for Africa YouTube channel. That small gesture will help the movement continue to scale its outreach to a broader community. So we thank you in advance for your valuable help and for your vote of confidence. In addition, I'd like to bring to your attention the call for speakers we issued last week for a LiveCast that we intend to hold on February 16, 2022. The title is Mobile for Inclusive Digital ID for D. We're inviting experts to submit expressions of interest to participate in the dialogue on how basic and feature phones and the associated communication protocols can provide trustworthy digital infrastructure in support of identity for development. While the topic of mobile as a platform for digital ID and mobile apps for onboarding and ID-enabled use are of interest in general, the particular focus of mobile for development will be given priority. Back to today's topic. In preparing for the trilogy, I had the opportunity to catch up with Sir Mark Lowcock, who up until recently was the UN Under-Secretary General. I wanted to get a perspective on our topic from someone who has been in high positions within the world of development and humanitarian interventions. It was an inspiring conversation, and we'll share with you some portions from it in a couple of segments in today's session. I want to thank Mark for his encouragement and advice on our trilogy. We will set the stage for our session today by playing 2 short public clips from that interview. First, I asked Mark what posture should the development community adopt relative to technology in general.
Joseph, thank you so much for the opportunity to have the conversation. And let me just say, I think the work you're doing is really inspiring and important and fascinating. And, I'm keen to learn more about it myself. So my starting point is that new technologies offer a huge opportunity to improve services and support for people globally, particularly very poorest people. And I've had some of my own experience in that. I was involved a long time ago now in the work that led to the establishment of the M-Pesa mobile money system in Kenya, which then spread to so many other countries. DFID, when I was working for them in East Africa, in fact, gave a grant to Vodafone for that. But at the same time, we provided advice for the Central Bank of Kenya to enable them to put in place the regulatory arrangements to make it permissible to transfer money. I've been involved in other programs in other places, for example, in an African country supporting the development of the police service, where what we were doing and trying to do was to build the capability and the effectiveness of the police service in providing social justice and safety and security for the citizens of the country. In fact, in that case, what happened some years later was that the police service became much more capable, and that capability was used to essentially exploit and repress the population. So I'm very alive to both the opportunity these technologies provide, but also the risks that go with them. And identity technology really exhibits both of those facets of the issue. It creates huge opportunities, for example, in making it much easier and straightforward and safer and cheaper to provide things like social protection services, social protection payments to vast populations. But it also is very vulnerable to malign manipulation, which can lead to the exploitation and the subjugation and the repression of populations. And I think one of the things that's becoming a frontier issue now, which you in ID for Africa are right on the cusp of, is that balance between opportunity and threat, if you like, in the fragile environments. And that's an area that I think we should particularly be paying attention to.
What posture we take relative to technology influences the narrative about mitigating the risks. ID for Africa shares Sir Lowcock's optimistic view about the role of technology in development. So naturally, we phrase the narrative within the framework of safeguards and mitigation and not the banning of digital identity. We have always encouraged exploring promising technologies as long as they are associated with policy, legal, design, and other protective measures to ensure that these solutions can only contribute to public good. In other words, our objective is to find ways to harm-proof identity technologies, not ban it. But please do not interpret this position to mean we believe that technology is the answer. ID for Africa adopts a holistic view of development, where we examine all aspects of the issues and we encourage dialogue among all stakeholders, including civil society, before we consider the potential benefits of a technology. One of the areas that we worry about in that context is data. This includes data collected during enrollment, as well as data exhausts from identity-enabled use or sectoral data, especially when a single identity number is used across all sectors. I asked Mark at a high level about his views on data. Let us listen what he had to say.
I think 10 years ago, there was a wide, not very thought through assumption that data was basically a good thing and by and large going to be put to useful purposes. I think we all must understand now that that's not necessarily true. So, you know, a lot depends on what data is collected, who has control over it, how it's used. And thinking about privacy issues, for example, that's a huge ongoing debate in many richer countries. The risks and the dangers of misuse of data are more acute in the fragile environment. The danger of dark data use is, is a severe one. And I think the most important thing for organizations investing now in thinking about positive uses of data is to be alert and aware of the risks and to be to understand that, you know, this isn't a static issue, that things change over time, and you need to think about future uses of data that you may have collected or allowed other people to collect, not just the issues to be faced today. All that said, you know, at the end of the day, I'm basically more optimistic than I am pessimistic on this. On the whole, I think that data empowers and frees and creates opportunities, but you have to manage the potential risk of the opposite happening, particularly at a moment we're in right now of larger numbers of quite authoritarian regimes around the world emerging.
Once again, on this issue, we have total alignment. We believe it is necessary to develop responsible and balanced data best practices that walk the fine line between collecting enough data to empower, but resist the temptation to collect too much, which could harm. In view of how critical data is both for development and in the landscape of concern, today's episode will take a data-centric view of the dark side of identity. Let me share with you the program for today's livecast. As you can see, it's going to be made up of 5 segments. In the first segment, we will set the scene with 3 quick talks and discussions with me. And then we'll have 3 spotlights where we delve more deeply into specific topics. And in those, we'll take 2 experts at a time and I'll engage with them. During the spotlights, you will have the opportunity, if you would like to participate in community voices or question and answers, to step in when we call for that. And then at the end, we have a segment we call Bridging the Gap, where 2 experts from 2 opposing viewpoints on the issue of identity will have the opportunity to discuss with each other or debate with each other with the hope of bridging the gap between them. And then the lineup for the 3rd part of the trilogy, which is scheduled for December 15, will be somewhat different. It's going to be a mix of different types of informative segments, starting with the to the point, plus a couple of keynote presentations, plus in focus, and then other spotlights where we highlight certain promising innovations that we had mentioned to you in the past. The objective here is to look into ways to build responsible ID systems by design. Okay, so we're now ready to welcome the full participants in this episode. With us today, we're pleased to have, in the order of appearance, Professor Carsten Maple, Professor of Cyber Systems Engineering, University of Warwick; Tunde Okunoye, Research Affiliate, the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society, Harvard University; Oscar Okwero, Cybersecurity Policy Fellow, Center for Intellectual Property and Information Technology Law, CIPIT in Kenya; Jonathan Marskell, Senior Program Officer, ID4D, the World Bank; Dr. Edgar Whitley, Associate Professor, London School of Economics and Political Science; Solomon Okedara, Co-founder, Digital Rights Lawyers Initiative; Teki Falconer, Founder and Executive Director, Africa Digital Rights Hub; Dr. Emrys Schoemaker, Research Director, Caribou Digital; Dr. Jose Areza, Legal Identity and Exclusion Researcher with the UNDP and OHCHR; Bridget Anders, Africa Policy Associate, Access Now; and Hadija Ali-Dagabana, General Manager of Legal, Regulatory and Compliance Services, the Commission Secretary, Nigeria Identification Management Commission, NIMSI. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for being with us in this important episode. We are going to start with 3 short contributions to set the scene and the scope for today's topic. And then we will begin with the spotlight and the discussion and debates. So let us begin with Professor Carsten Maple's contribution. Carsten, the forum is yours.
Apologies for that. Thank you very much. I'd like to start by thanking Dr. Joseph Attic for putting together such a fantastic set of presentations. And I hope, like I did, many of you watched the first in the series of this trilogy. I'll be referring to that throughout my talk. And I'll also be referring to the excellent comments made by Sir Mark just now. So my name is Professor Carsten Maple. I'm a professor of cyber systems engineering at the University of Warwick. And that means that I engineer secure, private, and trustworthy systems, including digital identity systems. I'm also a fellow at the Alan Turing Institute, which is the National Institute for Data Science and Artificial Intelligence. And I'm really pleased that we have a project funded also by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to enable us to conduct this work into trustworthy digital identity. The work that I'm going to present is not just my own, it's with a number of colleagues at the Turing. And at the end, I will share some contact details, and we'd be really keen for you to join us in our Trustworthy Digital Identity interest group when you can. Thank you. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is the transformational power of identity. We've heard a little bit throughout this series and the wider LiveCasts on the ID for Africa series, but what we can really see is that digital identity is really now becoming a gateway to resources and opportunities. Last time, when we heard the first part of this trilogy, we heard about exclusion being a significant issue, and that is quite rightly so. We need to address these issues if we are going to afford opportunity to citizens and people within country. One thing that's important to realize is that the issues faced in parts of Africa are not unique to Africa. They happen elsewhere, even in the UK and in the Western world. I will explain to you some of the challenges that we see and how any kind of identity system could be compromised. We can see how much economic value can be unlocked through digital identity. So we see in the mature nations of the United States and the UK, it's only a small percentage. But when we look at Africa and South America, significant economic advantage can be gained through the use of digital identity. But if we think about digital identity and how we want to use it to empower people, as Samart just mentioned, we have to think about some of the challenges around there. We are funded through the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation through their financial inclusion portfolio. They see digital identity as a way to raise financial inclusion and give opportunities to communities that previously could not benefit. If the aim is to provide opportunity to those communities, what we must make ensure that this fair and inclusive world that we are dreaming of is not in a position that it can be manipulated. And so Mark, in fact, mentioned about subjugation and other kinds of misuse. Unfortunately, there is a growing interest in perverting the use of digital identity and harming those very communities that we hope to enable. So what we want to do is ensure we can have trustworthy identity systems. We make a distinction here between trusted systems and trustworthy systems. A trusted system is a system that an organization or an individual decides to trust. Unfortunately, we sometimes trust things that should not be trusted. We are convinced to put our trust into a system which may be ill-placed. What we wish to do in this project is talk about making a system that is trustworthy. It has credentials that can be tested and verified as to the trustworthiness of the system. I've mentioned some of the challenges and reasons that people might try to compromise identity systems. And I give a little here about some news that's happened over the past 5 years. So in a number of different news items where identity has really been found wanting. One of the first was that in the UK, HSBC introduced voice recognition into its security system. Unfortunately, in a very short time, that system was fooled. It was fooled by a non-identical twin accessing his brother's bank account details. So something that was designed to be more secure was ultimately not as secure. Another issue was around these so-called deepfakes. So deepfakes are quite well known now. I'm sure you'll have seen videos that have been created with deepfakes. But using AI in a way to create attacks has been used to create either fakes of videos or fakes of voices. And this was one of the early attacks where a chief executive officer was communicated to in a voice telephone call by what he thought was the CFO, so it was a conversation, and sent money to an attacker. So that was a compromise on a very sophisticated system. And subsequently, there has been another attack in the last 18 months that was similar. We see technologies such as facial recognition systems. So facial recognition systems have been trialed in London in the UK and are adopted in South Wales in the UK. There has been a case around the use of this technology by police, and the challenge is that it compromises the privacy of individuals. And so Mark talked about privacy being a major challenge with data. One of the things that led to this case was because the assessment undertaken by the police was not as rigorous as it should have been. The impact assessment on privacy did not properly recognize how the algorithms that were used could perform poorly for certain races of people and genders. And we've seen that a lot previously with artificial intelligence. I did mention that we talk about some of the biometrics being compromised and identities being compromised in the UK or elsewhere. This is an example of a German arts student who actually managed to get a passport using a photograph that was merged between two different pictures. So the student in question took an image off the internet and then did what we call face morphing, morphed the two images, her own image and the image of a, as it happens, a celebrity, morphed the two images and got a composite image. The art activists actually managed to get a full German passport, and you can see it there. And what this means is because the image that you can see in this picture is not actually of the student, but it's a little bit like the student. It's like this image of the off the internet, that actually either the art student or the original owner of the image off the internet could both use this passport. Of course, that's got big challenges around, for example, human trafficking. So there are big challenges that we've got. And in fact, we were talking today about this in the Alan Turing Institute. And in the Turing Institute, we discussed UK passports in which you upload using your phone a photograph of yourself. Some other examples of recent identity challenges will include the Taliban biometric databases that people will have heard about. Now, of course, it seems unlikely that the Taliban will have had access because of the devices that were left in Afghanistan to the databases, because that can be turned off. But it is very likely that devices that have certain people of interest will actually keep locally some of that data. So that gives some compromise if that information falls in the wrong hands, as it did. Further, we all know that in the last month or so, a hacker has stolen government identity data for the entire Argentine population. And this presents a serious threat because, of course, we can't change our biometric details, but this attacker has sold the information on the dark web. Now, for those of you who were in the Trilogy Part 1, you'll have seen Yevgeny Sirotin talk about some work, and this is an image from his work that is really important and relates directly to the issue I mentioned with the South Wales police. What this shows is where you see a slightly darker red color in these 6 images on the screen, it's about how likely you are to be mistaken for somebody else. So in the bottom left corner, you can see that if you are a Black female, you are quite likely to be misrecognized as another Black female, less so for a white male, as one might expect. Well, this all seems quite intuitive in a sense, but the big problem here means that if you have a list of interested parties that somebody is looking for, and that party happens to be the same class that you're in, so let's say that there were a particularly large number of Black females on a list that were being looked for, then you as a Black female are more likely to be recognized than any other type of person. Now, why is that fair? Just because you belong to a class that you are more likely to be questioned. What's interesting in this work is if we look at irises rather than face, irises don't have these biases and present a way that we can consider without being biased. AI is also fallible itself. Some of the stories you may have heard of a few years ago where the Microsoft chatbot was taught to swear and be racist. And also that artificial intelligence can be compromised. Spelling errors in artificial intelligence input can lead to extra time in prison. So some great work by Cynthia Rudin at Duke University on explainable AI. So what are we trying to do at the Turing? So we are trying to develop a framework by which we can assess, and as Dr. Attic mentioned, what we want to do is use data to assess the trustworthiness of identity systems. To do that, we are going to look at the security of identity systems. Are they confidential? Do they have integrity and availability? We want to look at the ethics. How transparent, explainable, as I just mentioned, and how fair or unbiased are they? We want to look at the privacy of data, not only in the processing of data, but also in the communication of data. How can we decide if the data used is minimal? People talk about data minimization, but it's a lot harder in practice. We want systems to be reliable so that they are repeatable and consistent. We want them to be robust, that if there is some slight change in condition, environmentally, for example, that they still remain robust and work effectively. And finally, we want them to be resilient so that they can detect when they're being compromised. They can understand the impact of that compromise and they can recover. So at the Turing, we're undertaking an array of work streams, and it's great to have heard Samart talk about things that are quite important to us, about privacy. So we're undertaking new privacy enhancing technologies to support the trustworthiness of digital identity. We're understanding the dynamic risks that involve, a term that used by Samart as well, and understanding the threats through threat modeling. We are proposing a system by which there is real-time governance, adaptable systems, the dynamic nature mentioned by Samart that we're covering, so we can change the system as appropriate and provide the tools so that we can allow identity as a service. We hope that our work will be of use to the wide community and really do encourage you all to get in contact with us. These are my contact details, and I can also be contacted on the chat. Thank you, Dr. Attic.
Thank you, Professor Maple. In fact, we will be revisiting with you through the year as you make more progress and you're able to share the framework and the results of your framework. That's good. We're going to continue by now taking a very specific threat example, which was mentioned by Professor Maple, which is Argentina, the situation, what happened, how it happened, and what were the consequences of that. And for that, we have a very brief presentation from Tunde. Tunde, could you please join us? Professor Maple, thank you so much for joining us for this wonderful overview. You definitely created a lot of motivation for us to pay attention to how ID systems are being deployed and how their trustworthiness should be always put in question. Tunde, the floor is yours. Please launch us with this very specific understanding. What happened in Argentina?
Thank you, Dr. Attic. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure joining you today on this webcast. My name is Tunde. I'm an affiliate with the Beckman-Klein Center at Harvard University. I'm also with the Department of Journalism, Film and Television at the University of Johannesburg, where I'm researching how slum dwellers in Africa interact with ID systems. So today, briefly, I'll be talking on the dark side of digital identity, the case study of Argentina's national ID breach, earlier referenced by Prof. Carsten, right? So let me go down to the context. Next slide, please. Thank you. Yeah, so last month, I'm sure you're all aware by now, or some of you are aware already, RENAPA, Argentina's national ID was breached by hackers, and details of over 40 million Argentinians was assessed, including scans of ID cards, full names, photos, house addresses, ID card issuance and expiry dates, social security numbers, citizen numbers, and labor ID codes. Now, you know, the hacker actually posted some data online, including that of the president and the soccer star Lionel Messi, while he just put the rest online on the dark web for sale. So we ask the question, right? What motivates this kind of attacks, right? Now, there are different types of motivations, right? But in this context, it seems just money. Next slide. Right. Thank you. So this context, right? Money seems to be the motivation, and because the hackers put the data on sale on the dark web, right? Where we know there's a huge market for ID information, right? There's a market there, demand is strong, and where there's demand, there's usually supply, right? So on the dark web, right, stolen ID credentials can range between 15 to 65 US dollars, right? So that's an issue there, right? So we also want to ask, right, after a breach of this magnitude, right, what are the consequences? What follows, right? So next slide, please. So following a breach of this magnitude, you know, usually what follows are cyber attacks, you know, aimed at the population, right? Because some will be vulnerable, right? So, and there are different aspects of cyber attacks that might happen, and some might include identity theft, right? But I'll just briefly talk more here on social engineering schemes, right? So a hacker that has details of you, right, from the national ID register, he has details. It can give you, it can create a social engineering heist or exploit, right? For instance, it can pretend to be your banker, your staff from your bank, right? And kind of trick you into divulging sensitive data, right? That can access your accounts, right? And that social engineering exploits sent through emails is called phishing. You know, sent through SMS is called smishing. Sent through phone calls is called phishing, right? And when people are tricked into divulging this info, right, they lose money. Now you might ask and say, well, how is that possible, right? Well, for most people watching this, right, you're probably experts, you are aware, but that is not the case for the whole of the population. Yeah, next slide, please. Yeah, so yes, so you may say, well, that is far-fetched for me, but it might be far-fetched for you, but for most people, it's not far-fetched. Because, for instance, looking at our context, Argentina, right? The World Bank says literacy rate in Argentina is 99%, right? But we know that literacy is not the same thing as cybersecurity awareness. You know, you might be a distinguished professor, right? But if you are ignorant of cybersecurity safety skills and knowledge, right, you can be very vulnerable to cyber exploits, right? Like social engineering, right? And the Global Center for Cybersecurity Capacity at Oxford Martin School at Oxford University, they have a rating of nations, right? Cyber maturity ratings, and For Argentina, they rated user understanding, that's for the public now, public user understanding of personal information protection online and cybersecurity mindsets as formative. So they have 5 steps of cyber maturity from startup to formative to established to strategic to dynamic. So the lowest stage is startup, the most advanced is dynamic. So for Argentina, right, these 2 indices, user understanding of personal information operation online and cybersecurity mindset, is just formative. That is 2 out of the 5 steps. So you can see there a dichotomy, right? There's a chasm between literacy rates, like 9%, and cybersecurity awareness. So, and we have a huge breach here of an ID database just a few months ago, right? So, so you can see that, right? Many people in this population, right, they are left vulnerable to social engineering schemes. Thank you. So let's go to the, so you might also want to ask, right, you know, what's it about ID systems, right, that make them so vulnerable? So I'll briefly go through some vulnerabilities. Next slide, please. So one vulnerability is that, you know, in the past 10 years or so, the World Bank and many funders have been funding these ID systems across the world. And in some countries, right, some countries make design decisions, right, to mandate a single ID to centralize the ID data, right? So this creates a single point of failure, right? You know, so you know, and you know, when you mandate a single ID and you centralize data, right? You know, you create a single point of failure, which is very, very vulnerable, like we've seen in the case of Argentina, right? So next slide, please, right? A second, so let me just talk about that further, right? So that's why people advocate for decentralized, you know, databases, you know, those that are federated, right? So that you create more robustness in the system, right? You know, and instead of creating a single centralized ID database and mandating just one ID, right? So a second vulnerability, right, you know, could be the absence of tokenization or the absence of data protection strategies like encryption or tokenization. And here I just put the example of tokenization because, you know, when you don't encrypt the data or you don't you don't use tokenization, right? You know, when there's a breach, hackers can just access data and sell and just use it as they wish, right? So that's another vulnerability. And then here I only spoke about tokenization because it's simpler, it's cheaper to implement, right? And it has lower impact on relying parties, right? So you might wonder, right, why do people decide not to encrypt or use tokenization, right? Because this might impact on interoperability with service providers that access this data, or it might also maybe increase cost of transactions, right? So, and gov.uk, you know, and Aadhaar are 2 examples of ID systems that use this strategy of data protection. Next slide, please. So a last vulnerability, right, might be that, you know, in the past 10 years, right, we've had an expansion of experts, very skilled, right, individuals, groups, and nations, right, that are willing to use their expertise to breach ID systems, right? And really, no one is immune. You might remember the Office of Personal management breach of the US in 2015, right? Where that's the Human Resource Office of the US federal government was breached, right? So we see that even in advanced countries, right, these breaches happen. So if the US and Korea can be breached, it means that basically anyone can be breached. So it's not a question of if, but when, right? So hackers are knocking on the door. Let's shut them out. Thank you.
Thank you, Tunde.
Yeah.
Okay, so basically what Tunde has given us, he's given us that geographically, everybody is likely to be impacted by the risks of identity system. Hackers are operating everywhere, not just Africa, but also it doesn't matter the state of development of the country or the income level. This is a problem that's global and affects the whole world. Now, we're going to talk about, thank you, Tunde, and we're going to move on with the third part of this brief interventions by having Oscar Okwero, who's a cybersecurity researcher and digital forensic analyst with CIPIT Kenya. Oscar is going to help us scope the problem, not geographically, not by income level, but scope it from the perspective of sort of what type of identity has risks. We've been talking mostly about official identity cards and identity systems and population registers, but Oscar is trying to alert us that the scope should be broadened to include derived digital identities. So Oscar, welcome. Thank you for being with us. If you can unmute yourself and answer to me, what do you mean by derived digital identity, or DDI?
So thank you so much, Dr. Atik, and the two presenters have gone before me for laying such a good ground for my conversation about derived digital identities. So I just want to begin from the aspect that since the use of social media went worldwide, the user interactions through the likes, through shares, tweets, retweets of all the social media content have essentially created an accumulation of metadata, or what we'd call digital exhaust. And now through artificial intelligence and big data, it is possible to create up models that could use this or process this into what we call digital publics that essentially analyze the digital exhaust and create what we call the publics. And publics are essentially our interest groups through which you can either group people according to interest, according to geographic location, or even according to maybe topical issues like race or religion or whatever really interests you. So derived digital identities essentially is a derived form of identity that feeds off the digital exhaust or metadata that are created by users as they go about their businesses in the social media or generally the digital sphere.
Excellent. So obviously these are different from physical IDs. So what do you see as the key differences between them? What are the risk patterns that are different? Explain how the risk patterns will be different between the two.
So the most interesting part about derived digital identities is that unlike the formal identities that are essentially provided by trustworthy providers like governments or international organizations, derived digital identities essentially depend on who I would call the creators, who essentially control the artificial intelligence models that work on this data. So that is a key risk that unlike the normal identity, the derived identities are essentially controlled by whoever runs the algorithm that creates them, which is a big risk factor considering all the use cases and the misuses that have been reported with the normal ID. So that is a big risk factor. And also, unlike the normal ID that actually exists physically, if I talk about the normal, I mean, the IDs, the passports that you can literally touch and, use for transactions, present to be given access or to access some services. The derived digital identities exist only in the digital realm, and the existence are only known by those who created them, or maybe if there are sponsors behind that, or maybe government agencies, or even the digital platforms themselves that may analyze that data for whatever objectives they may have. And again, one of the interesting thing is that, and which is really key, because the normal ID, the users are aware that they have an ID, and an ID gives me this and this rights, and these are my responsibilities. The derived digital identities, essentially, the user a lot of times has no idea of their existence. And unfortunately, this is always kind of weaponized to manipulate the very user on whose data it was used to create, to manipulate this user whose data was used to create the very derived identities. And then obviously, the physical identities can be used to discriminate. That has been well covered by the previous speakers. But I just want to say that derived digital identities can even be used for worse situations. And later on in this conversation, I'll be talking to you about information operations and how these have been used to do what we call cognitive hacking, to essentially push users into a particular direction of opinion or even interaction with the digital media.
So I mean, you're talking about targeting people based on their profiles. This digital identity helps the people who are committing this manipulation to actually consolidate the information about somebody, build the profile, and use it to targeting. Explain that. That's an important process. It's a risk that we do not see in the real physical identity. It's a risk specific to the derived digital identity. Is that the case?
So it is in the open public gallery, and if you look at platforms like Twitter or Facebook, they provide essentially access to their metadata or the user data for research through their APIs. And a lot of times there is really no control of how far this can go. And a lot of times it's only controlled by the abilities of the very artificial intelligence models that run on this data. And to the extent that these are used by either countries or non-governmental organizations, they're just controlled by the laws and regulations that these users choose to abide by. However, with methodologies such as social media analysis, it is possible to essentially break down or group users on social media according to interests, according to locations, according to probably age groups, according to various interests, depending on how they interact with the social media through what they like, what they retweet, or what they share on Facebook or Twitter or whichever social media platform they use. So these essentially, through such an open source methodology, you literally can create what I earlier called digital publics. And these publics give you characteristics of a particular interest group. And with that, then, and depending on how really granular your AI model goes, this could be used to target these very digital publics for nefarious users. What we all know, obviously, is used for social media marketing, which is really, really effective. But these have also been used by government and non-government threat actors to target or to essentially spread misinformation when necessary, and some at times to even compromise access to information. So these, unfortunately, are very accessible, and the data is easily accessible for research on open source basis. But the risks really and the controls around this are not so well defined. And as we are all aware, and as widely reported during the US 2016 elections, these are some of the things that are reported that the operators like Cambridge Analytica have performed on the US electorate. So these are not just some imaginary risks. These are actually risks that have been implemented, and the results, I think we all are aware of, as widely reported.
Now, we're running out of time, but in what remaining time, can you explain to us, in your view and your research, how can we mitigate against these risks? I mean, we're starting for the most part to talk about mitigating the risks of formal government ID, digital ID. Now we have to also worry about the additional dimension. What type of regulations, what type of measures? Explain quickly, please, what you think we need to do.
In my opinion, the first control has to come from the control of how the information that is released for research purposes by these digital platforms could be used. So I'm thinking and I'm proposing that, digital platforms could actually put controls on how far or what level of granularity or dimensionality of their data that is used for research could be used. So a case in point is, say, if Facebook has biometric data that is used for by the users to access their services, there has to be very strict controls on how this can be used, because that is a really fertile ground for even dire misuses for these digital identities. Other uses, of course, there are lots of conversation around this, but one of the things that governments could perhaps have or enforce these technology platforms to be very open in the uses of the data they collect from the users, so that there is no gray area. If I know Facebook is collecting my data, they also need to tell me the metadata that is collected that I may not know exists, but that could be used to develop what I would call digital armor that could be targeted at me. And there is also need for international organizations like the UN to really come in, think about controls, because some of the effects of these DDIs and information operations to the degree of real warfare, but unlike the normal warfare that has controls, information warfare, and a lot of this is generally based on DDIs, is not well regulated and left up to each country and region to come up with their own control. So that would be an interesting and a very important intervention for even the bigger players, so that we all can enjoy the usability of these really promising technologies, but you also have to protect the users from the threats to their privacy and digital security.
Thank you, Oscar. We ran out of time. I'm sure the issue of derived digital identities will be on top of the agenda of many of the data protection commissioners in Africa and around the world, and it is a subject that we are going to keep an open eye. Thanks for alerting us to it, and we look forward to seeing you again. Operator, let's move on to the second segment, which is going to be a spotlight segment where we're going to focus on data. We're going to focus on data within the context of formal identity. And with me here, I'm very pleased to have Jonathan Marskell from the World Bank and Edgar Whitley from the London School of Economics. Gentlemen, thank you for being with me and with us. I want to focus on the question of national population registers. As you know, they've been proliferating around the world. Just about everybody is building one. And those accumulate data and their scope is becoming broader. So starting with you, Jonathan, what sort of worries or concerns do national population registers cause you?
Thanks so much, Joseph, and I hope you can hear me well, and greetings everyone from tomorrow in Sydney. I think the first thing with respect to national population registers, and this was covered in the last session, is obviously the issue of exclusion. When these become a dependency for accessing services and people cannot get into such systems, this causes very serious problems. But the focus of this session on data and privacy, I'll focus on those elements now. The centralization of large amounts of data, and Tunde presented some of this earlier, obviously creates the risk of creating honeypots and a single point of failure, especially when the technology exists today to federate or distribute information and to allow the linkage of that information across whatever federation or distribution network there is. This doesn't completely alleviate the risks, but it reduces those security risks of one database being hacked or breached, and then the information losing control of the information there. So that's really a major concern, and I believe we'll get to another one in a moment, which is the proliferation of a ubiquitous unique ID number. Perhaps do you want me to talk a bit about that?
No, we'll come back to that in a second. I want to go to Edgar. Edgar, Jonathan mentioned that there is a centralization trend. Is that inevitable in your opinion? Are governments going to justify their need to do business through centralized platforms, or you think other alternatives ought to be put to the use?
So the academic in me had my hackles raised at the idea of inevitability on anything. There are always choices to be made. But I think what this issue kind of raises is certainly having a single database, a central database, a single number that you're going to use is a very easy to explain, straightforward kind of solution. But as we've already heard, and we'll hear later on today, that also raises really, really important risks. So what I've become really fascinated with in recent years is the kind of flip side of having a centralized one, which is the interoperability, the distribution of your different systems, your different data systems, whether they might be functional ID systems, whether they may be databases of attributes, et cetera, et cetera. And so I'm really interested in, if you've got data in different places, how come in almost any context you don't see clear progress in saying, rather than me holding the data, I will just use the data that somebody else has collected. Essentially, why can't these databases get on well together? I think a part of this is that there's just a generic not invented here syndrome, which software development always has. I could build my own system better than you could do yours. There's a lot of politics around, well, let me have my new exciting shiny program using the latest form of technology and I'll get the political kudos. And then there's also an implicit or sometimes explicit distrust of the quality of the data in other people's systems. And so it will perhaps come back to this, but in terms of understanding and mitigating, there's a real issue about why don't you trust somebody else's data? Why are you not prepared to distribute the data across different people's systems?
So Edgar, let me stop you, because you're raising an interesting point of dialogue, which is you're saying basically, instead of centralizing, why don't we keep databases where they have been collected, where they belong, but ensure a certain protocol of interoperability and standard, quality standard among them, so that everybody agrees that if this bit of data has been collected by agency X, agency Y can trust the quality. So am I quoting you correctly in saying that?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that you need to have a single standard for what is there, but you need to have some metadata that can be used so that the other party can then make a choice about it. So okay, if you have a good database that's been really well collected, a population register with proper enrollment, really good efforts to avoid exclusion, but you store it in a spreadsheet that has no password protection in a building with no physical security, then although the original data may be good, the reliability of that data for somebody else to want to trust it potentially becomes a lot lower. Okay. And for me to decide, good data but not stored very reliably, how do I deal with it in that kind of way? Okay,
so hold on to that thought. Jonathan, let me go back to you. Basically, with data, identity can be associated with data. And so the question is, there has been a trend lately where people love to associate a unique number to that data. And that makes the interoperability much, much easier because you can harmonize, you can say this is the same number, etc. how much more risk does this interoperability produce, even if the data is sitting in different stores? The very fact that we have the same ID number, wouldn't that cause a certain extended risk?
Yeah. Just one correction I want to make, Joseph. You said identity can be associated with data. I actually think identity is data, right? It's just a special form of data.
No, what I meant, sectoral identity. Sectoral identity, use enabled. For example, I'm using my phone, I'm purchasing, so the data, which is transaction data, can be associated with my identity. Of course, identity is data, but there's also sectoral data and then identity transaction data.
Gotcha. So with respect to the unique identifier, so yes, you're correct. And we've seen this particularly in the context of COVID-19 response, where countries are trying to link different social databases, looking at employment databases, because they're trying to target who's affected and verify their eligibility for payments. So they want to access information from many different sources. And when this data is not comparable, when the dates of birth are in different formats, month, date, year, day, month, year, I've worked in several countries where many names are just initials. And so to match this data across databases is very difficult. And therefore, there is an immediate reaction to use the national ID number or a social security number, some kind of ID number that may be present in these databases. Now, if you have a foundational ID system and you issue a national ID number, for example, to everybody, this makes it incredibly easy to match data across data sets, right? It's a simple exercise. Now, just like it's very easy to do some good things, it's also easy to do some bad things, right? Now, if these processes are not secure, so for example, authentication and gathering consent to trigger the linkage of such data, then you expose people to a lot of privacy and identity fraud risks. There's many examples. In the US, there's the famous case of the social security number, which is not just used as an identifier, but also as an authenticator. So when people call up their bank, there was discussion just now about using voice recognition and fooling that. In the US, you just need the last 4 digits of someone's social. This information is fairly easy to obtain because there's been many leaks out there of databases with social security numbers. So when the UIN is used for many different purposes and it's present in many different databases, it's on an ID card that may be scanned to when you check into a hotel. The staff of that hotel is maybe selling these scans to bad actors, etc. This, as I mentioned, exposes the people to identity fraud and security risks. And therefore, there's a need to look at how can you mitigate these risks. Now, tokenization was mentioned as one method. It's not the only method, and it's certainly not a panacea. But tokenization, where you create different layers of identifiers that link back to the root identifier, is one way to mitigate these risks somewhat. So if the health sector uses one token and the financial sector uses another token, at least within those domains, you reduce the risks of whether it's unwarranted correlation, whether it's identity fraud, someone assuming someone else's identity. That's just one of the measures. You've got legal measures, you've got other operational measures through encryption, etc. that can be used. But for UINs and national ID numbers, it's particularly risky because these are permanent in most cases.
Right. Hold on to that thought. Edgar, do you think for the interoperability that you talked about, a unique ID number universally across sectors, across databases will still be needed?
Again, still be needed, still be a solution to those kinds of issues, but it's one solution very much based on your level of technical capability in the state. And even if you procure your identity system from a system integrator, it's still always, there are alternative ways of actually handling that interoperability between different systems. So you can build in interfaces that will allow the say, a temporary, a transient identifier or a sector-specific identifier. So it's really pushing beyond just the technology and the, well, this is an easy way to explain it, so that's the one we're going to build, to thinking about alternative solutions, and then very carefully thinking about how you're actually going to implement that. Is it going to be a solution that you're going to impose across all the different sectors? Is it going to be an interface module that will simplify those transactions so that your healthcare service can run doing stuff but just pick up those kinds of things? It also, just picking up on Jonathan's point about identity fraud, it's also making us very aware of the distinction between the role of the identity, the foundational identity, whether it's a number or a record or whatever, and the use that is made of it. So if in order to open a bank account, I am doing nothing other than saying, here is a state-issued unique ID, then that again seems a perplexing way of understanding the risk of opening a bank account. So there ought to be capacity in the bank, in the relying party, to say, yes, someone is presenting their ID, maybe we should do another check, maybe we should combine that with other kinds of data, and thinking a little bit of some of Oscar's derived identity kind of checking that you might also do. But if you are just saying, because the state has issued this, and we absolutely trust the state to do that issuing process perfectly, and the data is never going to be lost, again, thinking of the Argentinian case, well, that's a way of approaching things. That's not necessarily one that I would advocate, as you can see from the way I'm presenting it. You're making that trust relationship it's often implicit, because you like this idea of one number across systems and all the problems go away, but we're just pushing at the implicit trust relationships that are involved there.
Now, Jonathan, looking at the development context and all the countries that you have been intervening and you have been working with, can you point out within a development context a country that has walked away from the simplicity of the single unique ID number into something more complex, and leaving aside India, which has put together the tokenization, which is still not really something that I see a lot of people using in India. So talk about the development context and the use or the movement away from a unique ID number.
Sure. So to be honest, it's a novel approach, and I think Edgar hit the nail on the head perfectly when he said that it's a very simple statement, especially at the political level. Because in every country, there's a multiplicity of ID cards and ID numbers, etc. And this is often associated with government waste, for example. And when a politician comes in and says, we'll have a single number for everything, or a leader says that, that is very attractive, and it resonates, particularly with the people. So it's a new concept, and only a few countries currently, well, a lot of countries are looking at it, but a few countries are implementing it. And in the Philippines, for example, who are rolling out the PhilSys ID system, they're doing both front-end tokenization, where the national ID number is actually hidden on the ID card, but there is a kind of like a credit card number that can be replaced for every new ID card that's issued, that can be used for authentication purposes. And then they have a back-end token, which is included in databases. This is not fully implemented yet. We'll see how this goes, but it's a very exciting model that they're using. Nigeria also is looking at this, particularly on the front-end tokenization, and a few other countries that we're talking to in Africa are exploring the idea. Whilst it's novel in the developing world context, a number of countries have been doing it for a very long time, notably Austria. And Austria's tokenization is, very technologically sophisticated, and it's proven to work also at scale there.
Okay, great. I think we're going to cover Austria in another episode. I'm going to take a couple of questions that have come to both of you from the audience. And one is from Otsar. He's talking about basically, what are you trying to protect? Is the unique ID number a private something to be protected, or is this a public number? However, it points to a private data. What's the some unique ID numbers are private, some unique ID numbers are public. Where do you fall on this? And I'll start with Edgar, and then back to you, Jonathan.
Yeah, so I think the first important distinction is between the kind of a machine readable 50-character long random number, which is a kind of internal key for a database, and a 13, 15, 16-digit number that you print on the face of a card that people can key into systems. Mm-hmm. The other question is, of course, so if you have a number that I need to use to access different government services, then clearly this is for sharing with other agencies. And in fact, there's been an interesting academic argument that says that in the US context, because a national ID number is government data that's therefore true and issued by the government, it ought to be usable for any purposes whatsoever. There can be no restrictions on what government issued true data can be used for. So the other thought is also, is this number intended to be that basis for linking across different systems? Or is it essentially a proxy for, we know that this person exists, we have done reasonable proofing to make sure that there's only one Edgar Whitley who has that number, that I can't create multiple, the physical body cannot create multiple accounts? Or is it much more of that? And that comes back to, well, what data are you holding associating to the ID? And very easily you go from, well, you probably want someone's name, which might imply religion. You want their date of birth, hopefully, if it's got reasonably accurately, if you've got birth registration. Do you need their address? Is their address an identity feature or something that is linked to their identity? What about their citizenship status? What about their eligibility to vote? And so you very quickly move from pure identity data to identity-related attributes. And so part of that, so I'm kind of pushing the question back, because part of the time the difference is between, as it were, what your core identity data might be. And that might just be, there is a person that we have differentiated in the database, to attributes that are closely related to identity, to attributes that are derived from, associated with the identity, but perhaps don't need to be in the identity itself.
Okay, so you're actually touching upon something important, which is in the data minimization, the foundational system. Jonathan, talk to us about that topic, and within the development context, how have you managed to convince countries to actually adopt this principle?
Sure. So, and just to briefly answer the question before from Oy, all data needs to be protected, personal data needs to be protected, and it depends what the number is used for, the degree of protection that it needs. If the number itself alone is used, and let's be honest, in many developing countries, including developed countries like my own in Australia, you provide a number and that unlocks access to services. There's no authentication. And I'm sure it's the same in the UK, no offense, Edgar. We have the Ashes coming up, so I'm going to make fun of the UK, England. But in terms of the principle of data minimization, Joseph, the reality is, the other thing that I forgot to mention in response to your first question is that centralizing data, another challenge with it is it's impossible to keep all that data up to date. Getting the health information, the financial information, social information, etc., that's best managed by the people or the agencies that deliver those services. And really, that's one of the, apart from the honeypot argument, that is really a key argument that resonates with governments, because many countries have tried this, building a super database, that will simplify service delivery. And the reality is that after a few months, the data becomes stale, and they go back to using the Ministry of Health's information systems, for example. And so about building, some call it a communication layer, a data exchange layer, like an X-Road, an enterprise service bus, those kind of things, investing that whole of government approach to sharing data, that really resonates. And there's a lot of success stories. And the obvious one, of course, is Estonia, but we see a number of countries even adopting the X-Road open source software successfully.
Okay, let's be very concrete. And that's a topic that people seem to care about. Do you think birth and death records should be linked to the National Population Register, which registers your unique ID for service delivery? Edgar, how do you see this single source of truth where many countries are going in, we're saying everything about you should be in one database at a foundational level even?
So I take it slightly differently, but kind of very much in the lines that Jonathan does. So if you've got an agency who's registering births, marriages, and deaths,
right,
it seems pointless to duplicate that effort. It would make a lot more sense to say, if we want to create an ID record, let's rely on the people who are doing that. If we need to stop an ID record because we have a notification that the person has died, let's draw that data from the civil registration system, the population register, or whatever it is. And that comes back to the questions of interoperability. It also assumes, of course, that you've got proper birth registration across the whole country, you've got proper death registration as opposed to right to bury permissions, et cetera, et cetera. So to me, it's, if someone's doing it, trust them. And if you don't trust them, that's the challenge that you need to work to. Why don't you trust their data? Are they allowing people to be have births registered for fake people? Well, if that's the problem that you need to fix. You're not going to solve it by duplicating the effort. So
Jonathan, would you agree with Edgar that we should not be building a super identity authority in the sense that that identity will consume civil registration and then will consume identity management? I mean, would you advocate the fusion of these institutions or maintaining that institution separation for data reasons, but interoperability between them?
So it really depends on the country context. There's federated countries where civil registration is done by provinces or states or the local level. And that's embedded, for example, sometimes in the constitution. That's a more structural, fundamental issue to address. There are circumstances where creating such an authority is advantageous, and we see, for example, in South Africa, has an excellent national ID system, excellent civil registry, and the population registry is established on the base of those two things, and it works very well. In Thailand, where I've worked for a number of years, it's a very similar case. But there's other countries where it may not work as well. And also, I think it's very important to note that civil registration information is not just for identity, it's also for statistical purposes. Right. And for example, the UN Vital Statistics Principles and Recommendations, which set the global standards for civil registration and vital statistics, they recommend countries to collect ethnicity as part of birth registration, for example. Whereas for an ID system, that's a data field you absolutely do not want to be collecting or using. And so that serves a very useful purpose for statistical reasons. You want to know, how many people of a certain ethnicity are dying, for example, to understand if there's any disparities. But at the same time, there's a need when you're looking at the purpose for each individual attribute to separate that so that, these things can't be connected.
Okay, actually, I'm going to go very quickly, a couple of important points. Population registers sometimes contain certain attributes that history has shown could be subject to abuse. You just mentioned one, which is ethnicity, religion. We have seen genocides by identity, for example, take place. Do you think the development community needs a clear policy regarding unacceptable data in ID registers and basically say, you shall not capture this type of data in as explicit as we can get? I'll start with you, Edgar. Do you think there is a gap for a clear policy on unacceptable data and ID registers?
I think the idea of it is very attractive, but as soon as you start working out the details, then you're going to get real practical challenges. A simple example, if you are called Mohammed, then at least culturally, you are likely to be Islamic, or in an Islamic culture or an Islamic community. So are we suddenly going to say, because we don't want to have proxies on religion, we don't take someone's first name or family name, or so it's a nice idea, but the practicalities of you shall not collect this data because it can be misused. I suspect the way forward is to have and this is something that Jonathan said at the beginning, very clear governance structures that say, we recognize that, for example, even something as simple as a name, family name or a first name can be used to identify certain characteristics. So we will be very careful about who is allowed to access it, what kinds of aggregation, picking up on Oscar's, what kinds of derived analytics we might be able to do as a consequence. I think coming up with a definitive list, you'll end up arguing until the end of time trying to come up with that final list.
Right, fair enough. But Jonathan, I mean, would you feel comfortable if a program funded by the World Bank was collecting ethnic and religious affiliation or beliefs, or, you know, would that be a zone of comfort for you? Or how would you deal with that? Given that we don't have a policy of unacceptable data, how do you deal with countries that say, you know what, this information is useful for me, I want to capture it?
So, I mean, as part of our support, we ensure that there is no opportunities for discrimination. So we would not support systems that collect such information. But also, I know I'm from Australia, and every form that we fill in with the government asks if we're Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. And sometimes, I mean, this is for a good reason, to provide certain benefits and entitlements. So there are good reasons to collect such data when the right governance and institutions are in place to monitor, safeguard, and hold accountable, you know, against any instances of misuse or abuse or discrimination. But for a foundational ID system, such information is not really needed. The principle of data minimization is very crucial for us, reducing the number of data fields that are collected to the bare minimum.
So maybe the solution is to say, let's talk about what is needed instead of saying what is not needed. In a way, focus on the positive side by saying, this is what you need to do identity, uniqueness, and identity authentication. So this is what you should collect. So
correct. And actually just to build on that, Joseph, sorry to interrupt. Those agencies that need to collect such information for good purposes, they can just collect that when it's needed, right? They don't need to depend. This doesn't need to be centralized in a foundational ID system, for example.
Right. You can enrich the data in a sectoral way. Okay. Just one last question, because we're running out of time, and that's going to go for Edgar. Edgar, population registers localize people. Basically, one of their key functions, unlike digital identity, is that they want an address. They really want an address. And we've seen that becoming a problem in many developing countries, because in Know Your Customer, for example, the requirement in banking to have an address has created a barrier. But I also see in it one additional potential, which is government wants to localize people in order to deliver services, but you can also localize them in order to take action or harm. So how do you feel about the question of address as an information field in national population registers?
I think you've exactly highlighted the tension between needing to have address, whether it's for aggregate profiling, whether it's for any of these other kinds of activities. I suspect, again, there isn't a simple you should, you shouldn't. I'm going to go meta and say, again, it's about the governance of that. And ultimately, it's about certainly my kind of involvement with development agencies has not been to say, this is what I think, what I have a set, I can, it's obvious what I personally think, but you are the decision makers, you are the country, you understand your context. As long as I feel comfortable that you are aware of the risks and the challenges that you are facing and the potential downsides of storing the address on the population register, having a single unique number that you use for authentication purposes, as well as for linking across databases. As long as you've thought about it, that's the best that I can do, because I'm not here, particularly as a white Brit, to tell the rest of the world how to go about doing its things. As an academic, I can raise questions, give examples, highlight concerns, but I'm not going to say anything stronger than that, because I really don't think it's appropriate for me.
Okay, no problem. Unfortunately, we ran out of time and there are quite a few questions. I'd like to ask you, Jonathan and Edgar, if you don't mind answering some of those questions as you get off the panel. And I would say there are lots of more issues related to data, especially as you disaggregation of data, where you're using it for maybe human rights issues. Disaggregated data needs to be tracked, gender needs to be tracked, vulnerable community need to be tracked. So how do we make that balance between needing to capture that data and also making sure that that does not be flipped and used in an opposite fashion? So I hope to come back to you in another forum on this. I thank you very much for your participation and your insights. And I'm ready now to move on to the next spotlight. Operator, please bring the panelists for the National Security Exemptions, which is Solomon Okedara, the Digital Rights Lawyers Initiative, and Teki Falconer from the Africa Digital Rights Hub. Welcome, both of you. Thank you for being with us. I'm just going to throw it back at you and basically say, what is this thing about national security exemptions? Solomon, you were keen on bringing this to our attention. Teki, you have lived it. You have actually dealt with it in real world. So Solomon, guide us through what is the national security exemption that we're talking about.
Thank you, Dr. Atik. Now, to start with, national security, any day, anytime, should be a legitimate concern. Because in it, I tell you, we need to, first of all, have a country or a nation before we can enjoy the concept of identity, whether as a citizen or as a resident. But if you look at it, now, over the years and around the world, particularly across the global south, governments have repeatedly violated people's fundamental rights, particularly right to privacy, under the guise of national security. Now, I tell you, if you look at it, now, some of these mega tech companies, whether Facebook, Twitter, every year, they receive national security demands or national security letters from government, now requesting for personal data of their users. The point is about, to be accurate, in the report ending June 2021, from January to June 2021 for Facebook, Facebook claimed that it received a request of over 351,471 from government. And out of these 351 and 471 requests, then it actually produced data in 70.90% of these requests. Now, that actually shows how in large volumes, government demands our request for the data of users when it comes to digital platforms. Now, and I personally have said this, you see, government is the biggest threat to digital identity anywhere around the world. Now, so because the question we should ask ourselves is, what is national security? National security over time doesn't have a particular precise meaning from the standpoint of the government. All the government needs to do to violate a person's right to privacy is to write a letter and cite national security. So it's a very slippery phenomenon under which the government can easily violate people's right to privacy.
Solomon, hold on that thought. I want to bring in Teki in a little bit different angle, which is, Teki, we see exemptions in data protection laws, national security exemptions in data protection laws. How common are those around the world, and how common do you see them in Africa?
There are definitely standard provisions in data protection laws, not just in data protection laws, but even if you look at fundamental declaration of fundamental rights in most of the African constitutions, as well as the rest of the world, you actually see these exemptions of public policy, public interest, public morality, and usually national security. And there is a legitimate basis for it. In fact, it is quite interesting that just a day ago, I saw a BBC article on the ICO's, possible finding of Clearview AI because of an anticipated, engagement that they possibly had with the UK police in collecting facial information of people that are likely to be UK citizens without complying with the law. So these are standard laws. And I think that the major challenge that we have seen, especially when it comes to, use of national security reasons for collection and processing of IDs or any other information, is the fact that they are taken on absolute terms, right? And you will realize that under a lot of these laws, these conditions are not absolute. And you can even make inference from the constitutional provisions. In the case of Ghana, for instance, when I was at the commission, we had the opportunity of opposing the interception of postal packets and telecommunications bill by writing to Parliament on some of these issues. And we had the opportunity as a commission then to reiterate how these national security issues should be situated. And indeed, if you look at a lot of the laws, it is situated usually within the constitutional guarantee of fundamental rights, which also gives powers to courts and other third parties to make sure that the security rights that are given to these agencies are not abused. And so in like manner, I think what we tend to forget is the fact that these rights are not absolute. So whether a national security agency intends to collect or use data for any other purpose, it must go through certain requirements. And clearly, provisions under data protection laws, policies around making sure that the information you're collecting is minimal, making sure that you are, the only thing that you are absolved of usually under data protection laws will be possibly consent, of course, because consent will necessarily defeat, but it doesn't take away that right, to ensure that you collect the information in a responsible way.
Right. Hold on, Teki. Okay. Solomon, walk us through how serious this is in the African context. We are seeing it in GDPR. We're seeing now how member countries, this is leading to very complex situations, and member countries are trying to even avoid compliance with GDPR. It's kind of unraveling some of the key elements in it. Solomon, this is something you're concerned about. Explain to us, what is the real concern that you have, and what is the situation in a specific context of Africa? Why is it heightened concern?
Thank you, Dr. Atik. Now, I have a very serious concern. Now, recently, Nigeria, as a case study, decided to shop for consultancy services for consultants to work on the legal frameworks for its digital identification program. Now, but prior to that, the Data Protection Bill 2020 that we had, which I was privileged to work for, for some of the development partners to Nigeria. Now, there is a particular section in that bill. That bill says, in cases of national security, data privacy principle shall be exempted and nothing more. You know what that means? That means now any security agency chief can just sit down in the comfort of his office and write a letter to the data controller, the data controller in that situation, and demand or request to access digital identities of many Nigerians, now citing national security. That is only requirement of that provision. It doesn't say anything further. Meanwhile, that provision does not actually subject its application to provisions of the Constitution. The good thing is that Nigerian Constitution in Section 45 has a very brilliant check on such exercise of power. It says such a power, particularly in limiting privacy, has to be by a law, a defined law, and that law has to be a law that is reasonably justifiable in a democratic society. That is very brilliant. But the truth is that if you are going to look at the data protection bill alone, if that bill becomes a law, I tell you, it will make nonsense of everything we have called digital identity. Because it will give the government, it will make the government more than powerful than you can ever think. If the government becomes so almighty that it can do anything, and it will be able to justify it within the provisions of that law. And that is very impressive.
Actually, Solomon, just quickly remind us, what is the three-part test which you sort of would want to advocate as a litmus test for acceptability of these exemptions?
Very good. Now, the three-part test is that, now, just like Teki said, yes, privacy, like many other fundamental human rights, are not absolute. However, now there have been decisions of court around the world that before they can be restricted, three things have to be present. One, the restriction has to be provided by a law, not by a directive, not by a letter from the security agency chief. It has to be by a law. And that law has to be clear, direct, and should be devoid of any ambiguity. What does that mean? That means that as a citizen, then I must have the knowledge, the exact situation of what will limit my right to privacy and what will not limit it. It has to be clear. When it is not clear, such a provision shall be void for vagueness. Number two, then it has to be in pursuance or pursuit of a legitimate aim. Now, legitimate aim, of course, let me be clear that national security concern is a legitimate aim. But the question is, now, we cannot just tag legitimate aim in abstract. It has to be in context. Then, what is national security in that situation? Let me give an example. Now, so I think 2020, there was a musical artist in Nigeria that actually sang a song, and he did a video, and a particular government official found the video immoral or obscene, and in his comment, he said that fellow is a threat to national security. Now, so when you look at it, now, how do you marry immorality and threat to national security? In whatever instance, that video does not destabilize the country. It does not threaten the country's economy. So when you look at it, now government officials around the world have consistently abused the use of the word national security. And so they can use it for anything. So number three, now it has to be proportional. For example, tomorrow, a security agency chief can sit down and say, because somebody reported that a tech fellow somewhere in Lagos State or in Accra did something. Now, there can be a national security letter to access all the IDs of every tech fellow or every tech professional in the entire Republic of Ghana. That is not proportional. So for it to be valid, to be permissible, that restriction has to be defined by law. It must be legitimate and has to be proportional.
Proportionate. Okay, great. Solomon. Teki, how realistic do you think are we going to see mitigation against the potential abuse of these exemptions in Africa? I mean, or we should just expect that this is going to continue to be abused? Are there any real measures that we can bring to this to make sure that data protection laws remain legitimate and effective?
There's room for mitigation. However, I must say that the biggest challenge we face, as you may already know on the continent, is that usually the best form of intervention on these issues are the courts.
Right.
And those processes are usually very expensive and tedious and long. And so apart from continuing to urge governments to do the right thing, I believe that we need to also utilize the court systems to have appropriate oversight. Clearly, in most of our democratic states, yes, security agencies are regulated by laws. And it will be surprising that even without the data protection laws, you're going to see that most of these agencies are subject to rigorous oversight structures under the laws that even set them up or under the laws that they are going. So, for instance, in a place like Ghana, consistently the courts have held that you cannot use or collect somebody's information without obtaining the necessary warrants. What tends to obviously happen is that they will maybe go to the ID issuer. And in this case, because that's where the biggest challenge is, because the ID issuers are government agencies, the perception is that they are in bed with the security agencies, and so provide the information without necessary regulatory scrutiny as is supposed to be put in. And so some of the things we need to be, pushing for are some of the examples that it may not have worked well, but the UK has a good oversight structure that includes parliamentarians, that includes the courts, and even regulators, data protection regulators. We need to explore, and to some extent even civil society, where, at the end of the day, there will be constant scrutiny of some of these activities. And I think with time, we may be able to get to a place where, the security agencies will not believe that they are above the law, because I think most of these actions are not because of non-existent laws, but because of the belief that these laws will not necessarily be enforced in the right way against them.
Excellent. I want to thank both of you for sensitizing the community to the need to pay attention to national security exemptions and defense exemptions. This is a topic that also reminds us that we cannot operate in building ID systems in countries where the rule of land or the legal system and legislative frameworks do not have recourse. In that case, we might as well not promote the development of identity, because then it's easy for the government or easy for threat actors or bad actors to abuse the system. So I think this was a wonderful exchange. Unfortunately, we ran out of time. We'll keep that in mind as we look at the data protection laws and how the exemptions are being defined. Solomon, we are going to look at Nigeria's data protection law or legislation when it is ready, and we're going to examine it within that context. Thank you for bringing it to our attention, and I thank you, Teki, for joining us. And we love to continue discussing with the lawyers in Africa about these issues. Operator, could you please prepare the next spotlight? The next spotlight is going to deal with the question of fragility. Basically, we talked about ID systems being abused by government because they could be stable government, but they are abusing the system because they have built in the laws mechanisms to basically circumvent some of the data protection requirements, etc. Now we're going to talk about something different, where the abuse by a state actor happens because the organization does not have the institutional, or there has been a change in government, a coup d'etat or something like that. In order to warm up into this session, I'd like to ask the operator to play a video, just a very short 2-minute clip, where I talked to Sir Mark, on this question. So, operator, please play the video.
2021 has seen an unusually large number of coups, of military coups in multiple parts of the world, and you know, we need to be cognizant of that. And those things only happen when the people instigating them think they can get away with it. Now, there are always ways in which pressure can be brought to bear by the wider international community. My view is those pressures right now are a bit less effective than they were 10 or 15 years ago. That's a commentary on the wider state of geopolitics, but those pressures do still exist. And every country in the world is in a neighborhood, so it has no choice but to care about the views of its neighbors, and it's part of the global community, so it has no choice but to pay attention to, and it can be affected by international political opinion. So there are absolutely messages that can be sent, there are levers that can be pulled, there are measures that can be taken, but I think it is fair to recognize that at this stage, you know, the risks are higher than they were 5 years ago or 10 years ago. The particular focus I had when I was the person in the United Nations responsible for humanitarian action on anticipatory action, the particular focus I had was on getting ahead, being prepared in advance for disasters and emergencies which were predictable. Storms, floods, typhoons, those kinds of things are, and often pandemic-related problems, cholera outbreaks, and they're actually highly predictable. And you could do a lot to deal with them better by putting in place money and a pre-agreed response plan and the capability before the event crystallizes. You get a cheaper, better, more humane response if you do that. But I think the same concept of anticipation applies in thinking about the application of these identity technologies. And one of the things I think we need to think about in fragile contexts is that while you may think today the environment in the country, the political construct in the country, isn't such that there are high risks of the darker uses of identity systems being used are, you know, the thing you need to be worried about. You also need to be aware that things can change. And so you need to be thoughtful from the outset on how, if events deteriorate, you're going to avoid accidentally having created a system which is then used to subjugate people.
Okay, so basically 2 takeaways from Sir Mark is that deterrence by putting pressure on rogue actors is not as effective as it used to be. And then second is that the need for the development community to put in place anticipatory, to anticipate that this could be an eventuality that could happen. With me here today to explore these topics and beyond is Emrys, Schoemaker, and Jose Areza. Operator, please elevate them to the panel. Welcome, gentlemen, Dr. Areza, Dr. Schoemaker. I would like to start with you, Emrys. Explain to us the context where you've worked in fragile states, and of course, after that, Jose, please explain to us what countries that have fragile states have you worked in, and give us the context of your background. Unmute, please.
Thanks, Dr. Atik, and it's a privilege to follow such a rich conversation. I think one of the reasons that this whole topic of the dark side of digital identity has come up is because of the events that unfolded in Afghanistan earlier this year. And having worked there quite extensively earlier in the early 2000s, it's clear as the world watched the Taliban take over that there were real concerns about how this new regime may have access to different forms of data through systems that were developed as part of the developmental assistance to the country, but also as part of the military operation in the country, particularly the sort of biometric-based surveillance system that was put in place. And I think it's really important to bear in mind the distinction between those two. In fragile contexts, there are military operations, and in fragile contexts, there are also developmental operations, and they have different functions and different systems and governance
Emrys,
mechanisms and parts.
Hold on one second. I just want the context. So you've had experience in Afghanistan, dealing with Afghanistan. We're going to come back and really delve deeper into the situation and what the results and lessons learned. Jose, what is the context in which you worked? Please unmute.
Okay, so my first experiences with these systems were in Kosovo right after the war, and then in East Timor as well after the war, and in preparation of the first elections just before independence. But then more recently, Myanmar has really been a case that has really changed my way of looking at these issues, and a little bit of Sudan, which has been another coup d'etat, recent coup d'etat, unfortunately. So that is the...
Okay, so I could not have chosen better people. You guys have had the experience in the countries which had coup d'etats or change of regimes, which also were countries that had an appetite for digital or for ID systems that were being developed and being put in place. Emrys, let's go back to Afghanistan. Let's understand what happened there to the ID systems, as far as you know, and also what were the assets that were available.
So without wanting to go into too much detail, I'm aware of the constraints of time, but in essence, there were two categories of personal data collection systems in place. One was a biometric data collection system used as part of the military, the HIDE system, which some people in this conference may have had a hand in developing. And there were also systems that were developed as part of the state service delivery for doing things like paying civil servants, paying the police, the military also, for example, as well as, of course, a growing body of personal data collected through increasing access to the internet, through things like social media platforms, etc. And the concern has been, and there's been a number of articles and pieces on this, that data would enable the new regime, the Taliban, to access personal data and find individuals that they may have issues with. And I think there's a couple of points to make on this. I mean, firstly, in terms of the detail of it, it seems to be the case that certainly the military operation was a remote data storage design, so that although the Taliban have access to the hardware, they don't actually have access to the data. It seems to be the case. The civilian systems, the civil service payment systems and so on, the data is held in country, as you would expect. It's, there's a sovereignty issue here, and it was perceived to be right that data would be under the hands in the hands of the government in order that they can pay their civil servants, and also as part of the wider civil registration system that was put in place as well. There were concerns which have been subsequently borne out that data would be used by the Taliban to target and find and ultimately kill, actually, some people who they thought they were they had issues with, who were opponents of the regime, who perhaps were fighting them. Female judges even have been targeted, etc. So it's clear that we can see and take away from the Afghanistan case certainly two key points. One is system design really matters. Data minimization, data storage really matters, and making sure, and there's been a lot of discussion so far today around the issues of centralized systems, centralized data collection. Clearly, that's an issue. We don't know what the US military will do with the data that they have, which they still have. And that's also an important question, in fragile context, in any context. What is the accountability for data collection and ownership? But it's also clear that a technocratic-led approach to the use of digital ID systems, which is what we saw in Afghanistan, the use of systems for the development of states in fragile contexts, without a politically informed analysis of possible risks, has led to a situation where people are vulnerable and at risk, have been targeted and attacked because that data has enabled that to happen. That's an issue in Afghanistan. That has happened. But it's important not to assume that that just happens over there, somewhere that's fragile, somewhere that's dangerous. There have been examples, the Argentinian example talked about earlier, the Finnish example where health data was hacked and people were held to ransom for the personal therapeutic information that was very sensitive data. This happens in what we call the global north or developed states as well. The key point is we have to be thinking more with a more risk sensitive approach and thinking more strategically about how we develop systems in terms of technology design. Carsten talked about that in the beginning, but also about the politics in which these systems are deployed and developed, and using that to inform a risk-sensitive approach to how these systems are developed in future. And the final point to say is that this is a growing agenda in the development community. The digital public goods narrative is a really big part of where resourcing toward technology and development is going. At present, the issue of politics and risk is entirely absent from that conversation and desperately needs further consideration in that conversation. So I think there's a real need for that, greater attention to this issue.
Okay, we're going to come back to this issue of risk in this discussion. Just one point I will add, I will confirm that the HIDE system, the DoD put in place, and apparently they left a lot of devices behind them. They did not take them with them. In fact, those devices are as worth as a paperweight. They're heavy, but they're as worth as a paperweight for two reasons. They're very, very old. They date from the 2006 time frame. But second, they were designed very specifically. Once you open them, the flash memory erases every single bit of data. And that was a requirement for these devices to be deployed, not just in Afghanistan, but also in Iraq, where there was a possibility that soldiers who carry them could be subjected to fire or could be taken hostage, and the device would be captured. So it was not the change of regime at the time that led to that, but the anticipation that this could fall in the wrong hands. And this was the design criteria, and I can testify to that because I supervised the need to delete the data back in 2004, 2005. However, the other two programs which you mentioned, the e-Tazkira and the ABIS, Afghanistan ABIS, have given me lots of concern because of the fact that we don't know how this data is going to be used. So lots of lessons that we're going to explore on that. Jose, talk to us a similar context about what is the identity assets. Let's specifically look at Myanmar, where I believe behind you, that is Myanmar, if I'm not mistaken. So please give us an idea of what were the data assets that you were aware of and that you think now could potentially be a source of concern.
Well, in Myanmar, we had a completely different situation from Afghanistan. A system that was paper-based, that was very technically precarious, and which was being implemented based on discriminatory legislation, very clearly discriminatory legislation. This is the 1982 citizenship law, which basically establishes which are the national races that deserve citizenship, and then the others that have other avenues for citizenship, but which are in fact second-class citizens, or even stateless populations, such as the Rohingya in Rakhine State, but also other groups that do not have a recognized citizenship. And in this context, the moment I started working in Myanmar, it was the year of Aung San Suu Kyi's victory. There was an amazing degree of optimism as to how Myanmar will transition towards democracy. There was also a peace process, the Panglong II conference initiated, and donors and international actors were supporting this process wholeheartedly, no? And this included the area of legal identity. In fact, I was working in a project in cooperation with the Ministry of Immigration of Myanmar, where we went, an international non-governmental organization, and the ministry went to the villages to actually give ID cards to vulnerable communities in the southeast, Karen, Mon, Kareni, and other minorities, no, that had not had an ID card, paper ID card before. No? So this was the context. And the important thing is that this, for me to highlight here, is that the optimism was really too much, to the point that the Austrian government actually went to the Myanmar government and offered a loan of 33 million US dollar, I think that's the quote, to digitalize this terrible discriminatory bureaucracy, right? So, of course, this never happened, because first we had the Rohingya crisis in 2017, and then we had the coup d'etat, the very sad development of this year. So, but I think it's really something to think about. When donors get into a country to support the legal identity for all standard, and they don't really look at the politics and especially the risk of discrimination. And this is something, I stop it there to continue.
Okay. What makes this issue really, really complex is the fact that the very countries that need the most help in terms of digital transformation are the ones that represent the most risk. And also, we don't necessarily have an easy way to kind of anticipate that risk. Or, for example, let me put up a slide for you to take a look at and for you both to comment on. This is from the Fund for Peace, and it's color-coded. You could see deep red is meaning you go into deep alert in terms of the risk. And that's the fragility index of the state. And then the deep blue is basically sustainable and stable, no problem. Now, if we look at that, Myanmar is not necessarily any worse in the fragility index than most of the African countries that you can see. So how do you react to this type of measure? Do you think those are useful, or do you think those distort the reality on the ground?
Well, I think we heard it before from a World Bank panelist, that they will not fund systems which will lead to discrimination. But in this case, obviously the risks were not foreseen well in advance. There was too much optimism. It reminds me of this quote of Gramsci of being pessimist in the intellect and optimist in the will. So probably the international community should have been more pessimist in Myanmar, and not get into supporting something that then will be turned around and lead to the persecution that we are seeing today. So I think the risk assessment that we need for these legal identity systems, digital legal identity systems, is a very serious undertaking. The same that we have the famous data protection impact assessment in Kenya, that has been that has stopped the programming of Huduma Namba, and Jamaica, and et cetera, et cetera. So this data protection impact assessments, and also broader, human rights impact assessments are really necessary before the international community rushes any type of digital identity systems, which is going to affect the right to have rights. You know, it's going to really go to the core of human rights in any particular place.
Emrys, how do you feel that we should anticipate these? What are the tools available to us to anticipate fragility?
Good question, and the slide's very provocative. I mean, clearly it's indicative of where increasing trends in development financing are going, most increasingly being allocated towards fragile contexts. Right. And I think that raises huge challenges for people working and supporting the development of digital ID systems. We saw what happened in Sudan, for example, just recently, where we know that there's been huge investment in building out the digital identification infrastructure as part of social protection systems, etc. I think one of the challenges is that our risk assessment mechanisms tend to be very short-sighted, or at least to have a very short time frame. And for example, support to Afghanistan, it wasn't predictable, but it could have been anticipated. And certainly, although many people say that nobody saw it coming, some people were putting up warning lights around, you know, what could happen with a withdrawal. But the broader point is, I think, these systems are like railroad tracks. Once they're in place, they lead in a very particular direction, and you can't rip them up very easily. We could lay better civil registration systems, perhaps, but you know, laying ID systems regardless becomes a little bit path dependent. For all that Edgar was saying, that these things are about choices, we need much stronger political risk assessments. We've been developing some tools to enable a sort of broader ecosystem assessment, which we worked with some colleagues who are here in this conference today in Ghana and in Kenya. And I think there's more tools like that to be developed. But we shouldn't overcomplicate this. Most development financing institutions have existing risk assessments, safeguarding mechanisms in place. These need to be strengthened, and those existing mechanisms need to be more sensitive to some of the risks that these systems can put in place. But we also need to zoom out a little bit and think about, although we're talking about the risks in fragile contexts, these are exactly the same risks that we have anywhere else. They may be more amplified and more immediately apparent, but we know that people are at risk through the misuse of personal data, as so many people have described with so many examples already this morning and afternoon. I think human rights due diligence assessments can be very helpful. There's certainly a lot of work to be done to integrate those tools more broadly into the technology sector. That's still nascent. But I also think we need to be looking at, in combination with a political risk assessment, a much more risk-sensitive approach to technology design. And I think some of the references in the chat to things like tokenized use of personal data are interesting areas to look at. And we also really need to see stronger leadership around accountable principles for technology models and design. The UN has a really important role to play here, I think. Right. The UN's roadmap in this area is encouraging, but far more needs to be done to really put in place politically sensitive approaches to the use of data context, and also for the use of more risk-sensitive technology design, certainly in the digital public goods conversation that we've talked about. But to step back even further, there are also issues around digital sovereignty here. And a lot of the conversations in this space are oriented around, should the World Bank or bilateral donors support other countries in developing systems that meet certain standards and principles? And clearly that's desperately important. But countries also have their own individual sovereignty and will choose which path they want to take. And it's here where broader geopolitical considerations are coming into play as well. There's I think a growing awareness, recognition that tech is a field in which, as some like to cast it, the West and China's tensions are being played out. Digital surveillance models of Chinese state service delivery, etc., are increasingly cast as being in opposition or in tension with Western approaches or US and EU-led approaches. And clearly there's a competition almost, or an arms race to provide values-based technology development initiatives. And that's great to see. It's great to see a recognition that technology is political. There are values implicit in the design and structure of these systems. But we shouldn't kid ourselves that just because it's an American or European company, it's necessarily rights protecting, surveillance protecting, etc. The whole surveillance capitalism model shows us that an attention-based economy requires a collection of data, and these systems support that. So we need to be really clear about what values individual technologies and systems design embody into their structure, design, and also governance mechanisms if we're going to see technologies play a role in building the foundations for the digital transformation we'd like to see in the world today.
Okay, excellent. And just to underscore the point that you made, which is, in fact, the risk assessment mechanisms, both at the World Bank and the Austrian government, did intercept this project even way ahead of what was happening and walked away. I mean, I can tell you, I was very aware of many of those discussions. And in fact, thankfully, the decision was it's too politically fragile, we cannot move in. It was a multi-factor that was taken into account. But I can tell you, the decision was not an easy one. It was very complex, especially given that there were people arguing that this is exactly what the country needed at this stage in time in their development. Dr. Jose, could you sort of wrap this session up and give us your perspective as what we as the development community should be doing, having learned some of the lessons? Clearly, we can't say, well, because these systems have potential to be abused, let's just not do them ever, anywhere, nowhere. So give us your perspective, sort of in a pragmatic way. What should we be paying more attention for? What should we be doing more that we are not doing now?
Yes, okay. So I will give you my personal opinion. Of course, I'm not representing any organization there, but I think first of all, we need to have completely deep political risk assessments before getting into any form of digital legal identity system introduction in any country. And this is particularly important in fragile contexts where there may be a risk of coup d'etat, but also we should also think about discrimination that is embedded in legal identity systems in other places that are not so fragile, the Dominican Republic, India, and Assam. No, so the issue of discrimination has to be central to the political risk assessment. I think that's the clear point. I think the second point is that technology is fragile as democracy is fragile. So if we introduce an element of fragility into democratic institutions, maybe we are making them more fragile, right? So that is the second point. And then I think in a case like Myanmar and a case like Sudan, the international development community and the international human rights actors and peace actors, they have a very good opportunity to put in place what the UN has been terming the nexus between peace, development, and security, and humanitarian affairs. And in this sense, a nexus approach to the implementation of digital legal identity systems should bring us all of these safeguards and these guardrails that we have, not to include any type of conditionality to access services. I think that has been very clear in your previous sessions, no? And of course, the use of biometric systems, really, they need to be motivated by the real need and the real interest of the beneficiaries, because that was also put in place in Myanmar with the Rohingya in Bangladesh, and also with current refugees in Thailand. And now looking back at it, you say, okay, what for? You know, how do you comply with the purpose limitation and data limitation principles?
Good point.
I hope that's, you know.
Yeah, no, I think both of you have stimulated a lot of interesting thoughts that we need to be pursuing as the development community, as the identity community. I'd like to launch a call for action, basically to call on civil society and academics and researchers to help develop political risk assessment frameworks that go beyond just simply attaching a fragility index to a country where you can say, well, if fragility is higher than a certain amount, we're not going to engage. That's just not going to work in the development context. So fragility and development, we need more research. We need more thoughtful ideas from the academic community about how to go about doing it, because this issue is not going to go away. We are going to see, if it's not Sudan, if it's not Myanmar, Afghanistan, you're going to see what happened in Mali, for example, recently. Several other countries are on the edge of changing, going, etc. So we need to address this. We ran out of time, unfortunately, but I really enjoyed talking to both of you. Thank you for your insights and for being with us. I hope we will have another opportunity to visit this topic in the future. Thank you. So, operator, please move on to the final Bridging the Gap debate. I think we have with us Bridget Enders from Access Now, and we have with us Ali-Dagabana. She's so motivated that she's taking this call from the road. She actually is in Europe at the moment. She has to be somewhere at a conference, and we appreciate both of them joining us in this session. I will start by having Bridget sort of share with us your concerns as articulated by the YID campaign. But please, let's not make this a monologue. I would like you to sort of present some of your ideas, some of your concerns, and then allow your colleague, allow Hadija the opportunity to respond, so we have a dialogue going. So I'm going to step out of this forum between the two of you, and I'll start with you, Bridget. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much for having me. And I'd just like to sort of introduce YID to this forum as a campaign that doesn't necessarily seek to say that digital ID is a completely terrible thing, but we're seeking to understand more so why we need to move to a completely different system while the systems that we have already do not work. Why is it that the things that are motivating administrators and governments do not make complete sense when there is actual evidence that backs up the fact that these things do not work in the way that that we are told that they work? So whether it be from inclusivity, or it be to strengthen welfare systems, or it be to have a single source of truth, there are so many facets of evidence that prove that these things are not doing are not achieving the aim that they seek to achieve. And so I think it's really great to be here to talk about some of these things and see how, in particular, we can have a conversation around this and have access to administrative bodies and have them perhaps tell us what measures they're putting in place to make sure that human rights are being respected, even as we move to other regimes of ID, and particularly digital ID, and to make sure that people are not being excluded or disenfranchised, and none of these things are being mandated. Nothing is mandatory, and people actually have the right to choose.
Bridget, hold on. Hadija, going back to you, Bridget raised an interesting point, sort of why replace the systems? The systems haven't been working, ID systems. Why are we going for a completely different approach? Why can't you simply try to fix the old approach? You're mute, please.
Thank you, Dr. Atik. I think the response would depend on any particular country. I will give an example of Nigeria for an example. Yes, we had a system and we have multiple identity systems, sectoral, being carried out by different functional agencies. But then moving from what we had to where we are today is a policy decision to improve what was on ground. What Nigeria had then was data capture for the sole purpose of issuance of identity card. It wasn't an identity management system. And then when you look at the different agencies of government and private sector collecting data for their own functional usage, these databases were silos. They do not talk to each other. And a single person can be a different person in those different respective registries, just to be able to benefit from the service that that particular agency is given. So for us in Nigeria, it was critical at that particular time to harmonize what we have and then have an identity management system whereby these identities that have been issued can be verified and authenticated at any given time. So that was the purpose for Nigeria, moving from the old system of identity card issuance to identity management system.
Would you say that people's access to services has improved since you have put in place the new system? Can you cite examples?
Yes, definitely that is so. And then even also the security of the processes have improved. I will give you a typical example of harmonization we are doing with the different personnel records in the different ministries and organizations, both at state level and at the federal level. We have seen instances whereby some workers do not exist. What we term ghost workers. And these same ghost workers are collecting salaries and benefits from government. But with the harmonization of these identities, with the national identification number, we were able to reduce the number, and government is able to save resources from what was going to what these people you term ghost workers. And in the instance of benefits going to beneficiaries by government in different protective programs, you will see that we are able to eliminate what you call the middlemen that collect this benefits to share to the people. We are able to collect them because any system that does not use the national identification number in identifying beneficiaries, they cannot account for the beneficiaries they so claim to have issued those benefits to. So the usage of the national identification number and harmonization of those registries has been able to kind of safeguard and protect and authenticate the genuineness of these benefits that are being collected or shared.
Okay, Bridget, you may reply, or you may advance your argument to the next issue that you want to raise.
Yes, thank you so much. And Hadiza, I absolutely understand where you're coming from when you talk about the effectiveness of these new systems. However, we have to look at the inverse, whereby then we come to countries like Uganda and people are actively being excluded from the very programs that these things are supposed to harmonize. And you have people from border locations, or we have persons who do not have access to the centers where people are registering for these ID systems. So then what is the trade-off? So we introduce something new and we are actively excluding people from the services that we're seeking to provide to them based on the harmonization of a single system. And so then we have to really question how effective these things are. So yes, perhaps it has increased to a certain capacity, how you disseminate welfare or how healthcare is applied all across Nigeria. But then do we also have evidence that it has completely eliminated the problem? Do we have people who are previously being excluded now being included? For instance, if we look at Aadhaar in India, where even families that then were receiving welfare were removed from receiving welfare, or we have people who have now started receiving welfare, but it's not because of the effectiveness of the Aadhaar card. It's actually because if one fails, we just go to the next one. And if another one fails, we go to the next one. So how effective really is it? If we're looking at it in a completely holistic view, it perhaps may not be as effective as we think it is. On the face of it, it is, but I will call us again to look at the issues of exclusion, with Uganda, where older people are being excluded, people in border areas are being excluded, same to Kenya, where stateless people are being excluded, simply because whenever we go into new ID systems, at the end of the day, it is still dependent on the ID systems of old and still dependent on a system that was not completely effective and was not completely inclusive. And so we are simply carrying over the problems of an older system into a newer system. And so these problems remain with us. And as much as we might want to say that it is more effective to have one harmonized system, it is not the case.
Khadija, can you share your point of view on the exclusion potential and risk?
Hello, Dr. Atik?
Yes, we can hear you. You're back. You were disconnected before.
Sorry, I was lost. Yeah, I was yeah.
Hello? So Bridget was talking about the active exclusion of people which have happened in some places.
Active exclusion, yes. Yes, I had that particular part of her discourse.
Right.
And one thing, Bridget, I would like to clear with you is that no nation, no system plans to exclude people from access to that system or from benefit from accruing through that system. These are exceptions. And the most important thing for every program is to make sure that to look at the exception and then make provisions for those exceptions. That is the most important thing. There is no 100% foolproof system that will work 100% the way you want. That is an ideal situation. An ideal does not work in this world. So those exceptions are purposely there, no doubt about it. But it's for every program to make provision, alternative provision for those exclusions, to make sure that those exclusions are reduced to the minimum. That is the important thing. And Nigeria is not an exception. We are not saying our system is 100% excellent. We recognize that there are instances where there may be some issues, but then what are our plans and how effective are those plans? That is the way to address those exceptions.
Okay. I think if I could just come in, Dr. Atik, I would like to know, I guess, more of what Nigeria then is doing to look at these exclusions, especially when you're migrating to a new system. What is it that you're doing to make sure that the people who were previously excluded, whether it be because of statelessness or access to services, are now no longer being excluded? Because in as much as it cannot be 100% foolproof, there has to be some evidence that you are taking steps towards making sure that at least you're mitigating the losses.
Okay, let me just give you an example on even the data collection. There are people in remote locations where those locations are not motorable. They don't even have basic access. They don't have any presence of governments there. So what we try to do to bring them into the system is to kind of give incentive to our licensed partners to say, go to these locations, and instead of being paid $1 to do this capture, we'll pay you $2 or $2.50 to do this capture. And then in addition to that, we may provide even logistics for movement to those locations, logistics such as transportation or alternative transportation, and providing security to them. And that's typical example of Maiduguri, Borno State, where the insurgency is happening. So what are we doing to make sure that the people in those locations, because most of the difficult to reach areas or dangerous to reach areas are areas whereby there is a lot of services being rendered by government to them. So some kind of more support going to those locations. So we have to make sure that there are incentives to bring them into the system. And we are doing that between the federal government. It's a collaborative effort. The federal government, the state government, and even with the security agencies in some cases to provide us with the necessary security coverage to reach those locations.
Okay, so you would say that civil society has an open door to you to come in and say certain people are excluded, and you would be willing to dialogue.
Exactly. And currently, the licensing program we have with the private sector, whereby we have over 200 private license partners that we are working with. Our monitoring and evaluation mechanism is to invite the civil society group to be our ears and eyes, you know, where these people are operating. And it is from there that we get our feedback on the, if there are potential breaches that are happening in the field, they report to us and we escalate and try to remedy those situations. So we are working with the civil society to ensure that.
Okay. Bridget, continue.
One of the main things that we've experienced with digital ID systems, that is the biggest problem that we're facing at the moment, is the respect for human rights as a counterbalance. And so do we have adequate privacy frameworks in place? Do we have adequate data protection frameworks in place to make sure that people's data is being responsibly and ethically collected, that they understand why their data is being collected? Or, you know, for instance, we look at the example even of Kenya coming closer home, where we have the names, the Huduma number, and they collect a lot of data. And then a few months later, the court says, you should not have done this. There should have been a DPIA. And the question on our minds right now is what is going to happen to the data that has already been collected? We have no idea, because there are no systems in place that dictate what happens in such a case where the government has already collected so much sensitive personal data and now there's nowhere to take it. Do we then just leave it to people who might try to breach it, to people who might collect it and use it for their own means? And then, of course, there's the argument that a lot of countries are collecting information so that we have a single source of truth when it comes to the identification, and it helps with the harmonization, and there's a record from birth to death, from where they enter you into a system to when you leave the system. And then so the question becomes, how do we prevent this single source of truth from becoming a single source of failure, as we've seen with Aadhaar with the breach, as we've seen in Argentina with the breach, as we're now dealing with in Kenya, where we don't know what's going to happen to millions of people's data. And that's one of the things that we're trying to explore. Do we have adequate frameworks in place for us to implement such programs and such regimes where just millions of people's data, personal data, biometrics are being collected without a real view of what is going to happen to this data?
Okay, Patience. I will still reiterate it. There's no foolproof system. But I can tell you that the beauty of the Nigerian project is that before the identity management commenced, we had a legal and regulatory framework in place. So we did not start like the Aadhaar. We started with a legal framework. There was a law passed by Parliament, and in that law, more specifically, Section 26 of that law provide for protection of data of citizens. And by that, where consent is specifically specified. And following up with the provision of the law by Section 27 of the NIMSI Act, we were empowered to come up with regulation, gazetted regulations, which we have done. And there's a regulation on the access to the data. Access, classified access level based on usage, and then access by security agencies, even though it is unlimited, but there's a requirement, there's a clear defined requirement and guideline for how that access can be done by security agencies. So it's not an open-ended access to the national ID database. There are, like I said, there are guidelines. There must be a reason for that access by a security agent, and then the agency and that security agency must have an assigned verifiable person that will have access. It's not every security agent that will have access. There's a defined officer at a particular level that can have access to that database. Yes, the centralized database, the national identity database, is the unique database that issues the unique identity, a single source of truth, which is very clear. And then, but we have to make sure that collection of that data at the point of collection, at the point of transmission, storage of that data, we have to make sure that we have every security apparatus that we can find to make sure that our system, our processes, our personnel are guided and protected. So, and then to add to that, there's a national data protection regulation in the country currently now, which is in existence. However, the country is working on the data protection law. The request for expression of interest just closed about last week, and the process of evaluation of the combination of international and local consultants to review the draft that we have, to fine-tune it, to make it in line with international best practices, is on ground. While in the absence of that, there are legislation in almost every legislation in the country of agencies that are into one data capture or the other. There are provisions in those legislation. And our own, the grand norm, the Constitution also has provision to protect data and to protect marginalization and exclusion of people from federal activities.
Okay, thank you, Khadija. Anybody wants to join the panel through Community Voices, raise your hand. If somebody's hand is raised, please bring them on the panel. If they want to make any comments before we close. Operator, is anybody on the panel raised hands? Please bring them on as we continue. Bridget, the floor is yours. Continue.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think the main thing for me when we start talking about data protection issues, and then we start talking about the what is it called? Limitations to data protection and privacy laws and Teki, yes. Exceptions, and Teki had a really great take on it. And I would like to bring that up again, because a lot of the times we see, and in this region specifically and particularly, we have a long history of this, where there is a discretionary exception to certain arms of government, to certain administrative bodies. And, when we start to look at things like that is when I start to then again wonder, what steps can we realistically take to make sure that we have all the information at hand? Because of course, when it comes to matters of national security, and we've seen this a lot, I know a lot of people in the region have seen this in their country, where the only reason we're given is for national security, and there is no expansion on that. And why is there no expansion of that? Because it is a matter of national security. And so it is a matter of high privacy, high risk. We cannot be told everything. And so how do we then deal with the trade-off? Right. How do we
Bridget, since this topic was handled in a whole panel, we agree 100% on the criticality and importance of it. I think it's important that we leave that topic aside, because the experts are not with us on this topic. We've already covered it. So move to another area, or let us, if you want to reflect your thoughts, I can move to the Community Voices while you're thinking.
Just one more thing that I would like to say is that as the administrative bodies and governments continue to implement these regimes, because it is now an accepted fact that it is happening, we need to ensure that as much as possible there is civic education around these things, that people are not being scared into moving to new regimes of ID. For instance, and just to give a really real life example of what happened in Kenya, I was in a taxi the other day, and the taxi driver says to me that the only reason he registered for Huduma number, this was before the data protection impact assessment judgment came out, is because he was scared that he would not be able to access government services. To do this to citizenry is unethical. It is not right. There is no situation where someone should be scared of losing their citizenship privileges simply because they do not migrate to a new regime that they do not fully understand.
Okay.
Bridget, I agree with you that there has to be a lot of enlightenment to citizens. But then one thing we need to understand is against the individual rights or rights of a person, there is the collective responsibility of the federal government to protect, or the government to protect the collective rights. You understand? So because I'm afraid of losing my citizens, I live in a community. So I have to be guided by the rules governing that community. And if my exposure for not being in the identified will affect the other people living within my community, I don't think it is a coercive action by government to mandate people to register. I think mandatory depends on where you're coming from. If you leave it open, I can assure you from where I am in Nigeria, a lot of people will not go and register. And so it has to be mandatory. It has to be tied to some services of government that a citizen is enjoying, for a citizen to come out and exercise and perform that civic. It's a civic responsibility. To me, it is a civic responsibility. And if I live in a community, then I have to abide by the rules of the community and ensure that the collective rights of other peoples are protected.
Okay, Hadija, hold on there. Let's bring in some more people into the argument. John, the floor is yours. State your purpose. Introduce yourself.
Hello, Joseph. Thank you for inviting me. So on my side, I'm Joan Dubois. I'm 10 years experience on identity system as a project manager and product manager. And now I'm moving to be a freelance consultant for government in a company which is ID2030. So I'm not a person from policy. I'm more a doer, an implementer. And so when I see the ID system, I see like an opportunity. I think I see the half glass full of it. And so when I have to focus on these issues that are very important, that are very real, that we see everywhere, I'm trying to see how we can minimize, how we can reduce the impact, and we can increase the inclusivity and also protect the privacy of people. So first, this kind of national ID systems are always a minimization of data. Minimization to what you need to recognize a person, not to know who he is, what he's doing. Yeah. These data are to be put in the functional system. The way also to guarantee this is also to separate this data. So, which means the unique number, at the best, in the ideal world, should be some kind of private number, which is besides some usage number, sectorial number, that you can then decide to revoke, that you can also maybe place under the control of the individual. Okay, so that's some implementation. So unique number, private, and having some sectorial number that are really under the individual control. Okay, talking about registration of people, there are ways to include. As Aziza said, there can be some provision. So workaround can be put in place to treat this kind of system, this kind of issues. And notably that some claims that can be addressed in specific process. So that's part of implementation of a platform.
Okay, thank you, John, for your comments. Actually, Mudasiru, please introduce yourself and state your point.
Hello, good evening. My name is Mudasiru Dahiru from Sokoto State of Nigeria, working with the Ministry for Development. It's undeniable that NIMC in Nigeria has done a lot of things, not only covering the 65 individuals in Nigeria, but it also mandated for other institutions like JAM, that you cannot write JAM without a NIMC. In addition to this, in all the organizations that capture data in Nigeria, NIMC is the best. Since it started with the 11 digits, it showed that it can accumulate over 200 million Nigerian. In the other hand, also NIMC, there are, let me say, weakness, which I would like to draw the attention of Hadija or ask Hadija is, how far have you gone in harmonizations of data in Nigeria? And though you cover 65 million Nigeria, but still there are people who are suffering with the issue of ID card or problem of changing the date of birth or names. It has failed. As you can see, Hadiza, you centralize it. You cannot, an individual cannot do it within the state. You have to take it to Abuja, which is a long process for them. And it brings a lot of delay. And how far have you gone in improving your database? You can see when it's enrolling, though you have a good framework, like ecosystem as you're doing, as you can see, individual can go in the area within to enroll himself. But as you can see, the database is slow. There is a need to improve your database. How far have you gone that? And the last thing I want to know is that, Hadiza, how far have you gone in presenting the bill to the National Assembly? As I heard that the bill will be presented to National Assembly before end of the year. And that one will give NIMSI a power to have access to the information that you have been denying by other institutions. And thank you very much for giving me this space. Have a nice day.
Adisha?
Dr. Atik, I will respond to him on harmonization. You should know currently we are doing harmonization with the SIM registry. We have gone far with the bank, and harmonization is a tedious task because most of the agencies have used different standards, and the National ID Management System has a unique standard that they have to adhere to. So harmonization is sector by sector. And I'm glad he mentioned the example of the examination body JAM. And this is where the use of unique identity really helped the education system. Prior to the adoption of the NIN, mandatory use of NIN for examinations, you have people that are professional examination writers that are all over the country. Some dubious parents pay a huge sum of money to get some other people to sit for their children's exam. But because of the insistence of the NIN that every student sitting for that from high school to university exam must have the national identification number, the agency has rated the 2021 examination as the best examination they have ever had since the creation of that agency. We were able to eliminate people that have no business being in examination room from being in examinations room, and the real candidates sat for the exams, and thus giving credibility to the educational system. On the changes, modification that he spoke about, modification is not it is not taken to Abuja. There are state offices whereby you walk to state offices and submit your application. It's from the state office they send to headquarters, where those processes, those applications are processed. Database is slow. Database is not slow. It's just that we have reached the capacity of the database as it is now. And the president, in his wisdom, through the Honorable Minister of Communications, has given approval for funding for the NIMS to expand the capacity of its ABs and the database. Currently, we have 100 million capacity. We are increasing to 250 million. And we have already executed all the necessary contracts. And by the first quarter of 2021, the system will have the necessary upgrades, and expansion will happen. And then with the commencement of the digital ID ecosystem, also the system, the infrastructure that needs to be upgraded also is all part of the funding process for funding for that project. So on the data protection bill, I just stated earlier on that the document is going through scrutiny, going through international and local consultants to fine tune it. So once the process is completed, it will be presented to the National Assembly.
Okay, excellent. So we are going to close with someone that wants to join the panel, Community Voices. In the meantime, Bridget, I'll give you the chance to gather your thoughts for giving the closing remarks of the session. So operator, bring in whoever is still in the pipeline for very, very brief community voice. If that person is not there, operator, could you please confirm? My indicator shows that there's somebody in the pipeline. Okay.
Hello, Dr. Atik. It seems as if we've lost this person.
Oh, here he is.
Oh, no, he's here. Sorry.
Hamidou Husseini. Actually, do we need a translator as well? Do we need Diane?
My internet all went off.
Okay. Do we need Hamidou, vous allez parler en français ou en anglais? Bring Diane.
En français.
En français, OK. Diane.
Ouais. Donc,
okay.
Bonjour Joseph, bonjour à tous les panélistes. Je suis heureux de prendre la parole en ce moment crucial de l'identification. Moi, je suis Hamidou
Joseph. Lentement, Hamidou.
D'accord.
OK.
Greetings, Joseph, and greetings to the whole community. I'm very glad to join this discussion.
Je travaille avec la Direction générale de l'État civil des migrations et des réfugiés du ministère de l'Intérieur du Niger. Nous sommes en train d'implémenter une base informatique pour permettre d'avoir un numéro d'identifiant unique pour toutes les personnes résidentes au Niger, ce qui nous permettra de garantir...
Hamidou, il faut que l'interprète puisse suivre. Lentement, s'il vous plaît.
D'accord. Donc, je disais, je travaille avec...
Oui. Non, elle a compris. Elle va interpréter déjà. Okay, Diane.
So my name is Hamidou Husseini, and I work with the civil state in Nigeria, and I'm working on the establishment of a unique digital ID number.
Okay.
And he has been muted.
Une base de données déjà de l'enrôlement qui a eu lieu lors des élections au Niger avec une identité fixée pour certaines personnes. Une base de données de près de 7 millions de personnes. Et c'est en cela que j'apprécie beaucoup l'expérience du Nigeria, que nous nous réjouissons, malgré les quelques défaillances que nous constatons. Parce que moi, je travaille sur le système d'enregistrement de tout à l'état civil. Nous voyons un peu les déplacés nigériens au Niger qui arrivent sans aucun document d'identité.
Hamidou.
So we have established a database in Nigeria of over 7 million people in the occasion of
Niger.
In the occasion of election, and despite differences, the civil state registry has been working in providing identity because they have been seeing a lot of people arriving without identification.
Hamidou, please state your point. Qu'est-ce que vous allez dire? Est-ce que c'est une question? Est-ce que c'est un constat? Parce qu'on n'a pas le temps.
D'accord. Ma question, c'est par rapport au Nigeria. Adiza a évoqué l'aspect de non-exclusion par rapport à un certain nombre de communautés. Or, je me rends compte que depuis 2014, avec la crise de Boko Haram, il y a beaucoup de Nigériens qui sont au Niger, qui sont arrivés et qui n'ont pas d'identité. Près de 300 000. Et parfois, nous, au moment de l'enregistrement de leurs enfants une fois à la naissance, et quand nous voulons un document d'identité le permettant d'avoir leur identité, il n'existe pas. Je demande comment se fait-il qu'avant la crise, l'ANUMSI était installée et que cela n'ont pas pu accéder à ces documents.
Okay, Diane, please.
The question is for Hadiza. It regards Nigeria, especially the non-exclusion aspect. And he is questioning, considering after the Boko Haram crisis in 2014, a lot of people have arrived in Nigeria without identity, around 300,000 people. They have arrived without a identity document. So how come this happened, and what was the situation before the crisis?
Well, I don't really get the question. Is it that they arrived Nigeria or they arrived Niger?
No, they arrived in Niger. He says about 300,000 Nigerians came to Niger and they don't have documents.
Well, in situation of crisis like that, you don't expect them to have documents when they are trying to flee to flee with their lives to reach safety. What we do, like for in-country, what we do for migrants and those displaced persons or refugees that we do not expect them to have identity document coming from wherever they are coming from. We rely on the officials of those refugee camps to have a register of those people. And that's the only breeder document we collect. We register them in the different locations they are, following the register documented by the aid workers. Some are a combination of the local authorities and the international support communities that are in those locations. So that's how we register them. But we register them as in Nigeria, but we have to make sure that they have to present their country of origin, where they are coming from. The database recognizes registration of Nigerian citizens and non-Nigerian citizens that are within the country, whether they are residing by choice, or they are there because they are refugees, or they are, they were internally displaced or externally displaced persons. So we register them. For people that went across to Niger, I cannot, you do not expect them to pack all their belongings or their identities when they are running away for their lives. So that is expected. And either Niger register them, or like, I know there's an agency of government in Nigeria that goes to the neighboring countries to repatriate those Nigerians that have gone across the borders in time of crisis, to return them back and to resettle them within the country. So when they bring them back for resettlement, there's a collaboration between us and those agencies to document them and register them and issue them with their national identification number.
Okay. So Adija, thank you. This is a topic offline. I mean, it's off topic. But let's go back to Bridget, who will close the session with her closing remarks and assessment. Bridget.
As we close, I'd like to invite all of you to read Access Now's paper that we published on big ID myths, which I have put in the chat. Until then, we will continue to ask the question, why ID, until we can make sure that nobody is excluded, that the ID systems that are being implemented respect human rights and people are in the best situation possible.
Excellent. In fact, we not just invite Access Now, but we invite all civil society to be part of the identity discussion and the development community discussion. These discussions are taking place, and civil society has an important place at the table. It's not just the government, not just the development agencies or the private sector, but you are the guardians of making sure that things are done right and respect for human and social rights continue to take place. So we welcome you at ID for Africa. You are a part of our community. So we feel these type of dialogues are very helpful, not just for you, but also for all the other stakeholders that need to hear you and need to listen to some of the risks. Today was a heavy session. We've had a lot of issues and lots of risks that were evoked by lots of experts. We knew that the dark side of identity can get very, very dark, because this is a powerful technology. The ability to transform people's lives in a positive way can also be turned and transform them in a negative way, unless we, as the guardians of good and the guardians in support of human rights, are vigilant all the time. And so we're going to continue this vigilance. This trilogy will continue with the next third part on December 15, where we're going to talk about some experiences with design issues. We don't claim to have the answers. We are not promoting that. We're promoting the dialogue that hopefully will, over time, will guide all the stakeholders together to find answers that walk the fine balance between respect of right and then enablement and empowerment, to promote economic growth and to promote convenience and ease of access. So until then, please take care, and we hope to see you back again with us on December 15. Thank you for being with us.